Thank you very much for coming tonight. This is going to be, I'd like to welcome you to our first ever celebration of privacy. And there are some pretty amazing people that we're going to give awards to. And Latanya, of course, is going to start the evening shortly. But first I want to say welcome again to everyone. And I want to ask you to please recognize with applause our consumer partners. I think you saw the circulating slides, and we want to thank all of the consumer groups that helped put this summit on. Thank you. And of course, in addition to our consumer partners, we're very, very grateful to our corporate sponsors, who are, I think, all represented here tonight. And let's see. And then, of course, we had our academic partners. I think if you would applaud for them too, recognize them: the O'Neill Center, RTI, University of Cambridge, Harvard Data Privacy Lab, and the University of Texas School of Information. So thank you very much for that. And of course, I want to say that this night, this special evening, our sponsor for this is Fair Warning. And you all heard Kurt, I think, a little earlier today. Kurt, if you would stand and please be recognized. We want to thank him so much. And just once again to remind everyone, there's a slide that shows you who our 3 best privacy technologies of 2012 were. Yes, and let's see. Yes, they got awards too this afternoon. Okay, and I guess before we get into the program, there's one other person I want to thank, the supplier of the fine wine tonight, my wonderful husband, Larry. I don't know how all of you feel about your spouses, but I couldn't be here without the help of my spouse and his support. So, and you know it took a lot. So thank you for that. So I want to just talk a little bit about this next thing that you're going to see, this project that Latanya thought of and that Patient Privacy Rights is very proud to support. We're working together with Latanya and the Harvard Data Privacy Lab to begin to map out where data flows. And I think those of you that were here today and that were here a year ago know that the key problem for patients and for consumers is we don't know where our data is. We do not know. Raise your hand if you think you know, because we're going to employ you to help fill in the blanks for the datamap.org. Okay, so, and it's patently unfair to ask people to balance risks and benefits when you have no idea what the risks are. It's patently unfair. I think Latanya would say it's worse than that, it's impossible. So, Latanya, of course, is the privacy rock star in the computer science world, and I'm pleased to say she's a very dear friend. And she's a recent new board member for Patient Privacy Rights. So all of you who think I don't know enough about technology, I've got a really great advisor now. So Latanya, would you like to come up and introduce the datamap.org?
It's great to be here and also to see so many of you. Some of you with names I knew the names and not the faces. Some of you knew the faces, but your hair is a little older, a little grayer, but it's all good. It's all great to see the old friends and make new ones as well. And thank you, Deb, for this opportunity. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Society has experienced exponential growth in the amount of data that's collected on individuals. And with so much data readily available, you might expect to see a litany of harms. But such cases seem really rare. So we could postulate why that's so, But one of the reasons is that there's a lack of transparency in data sharing arrangements, and hidden data sharing hides harms. Harms may be happening, but our current environment makes causes of harms difficult to detect. The goal is not to thwart data sharing or to stop it. The goal is to recognize that there are important benefits to society from data sharing, but we can't move forward responsibly without understanding what's really happening. So there were earlier reports of potential harms. In 1996, Linode surveyed Fortune 500 companies, and about a third of them said that they used medical records to make hiring, firing, and promotion decisions. If so, we can ask ourselves, where did the employers get the information? In 1995, the New England Journal of Medicine published a reference to a case in which a banker crosses information with debtors at his bank with information on a cancer registry. And if there was a match, he would tweak the creditworthiness of the person. So is that really possible? And why are there no recent reports? Did we somehow solve the privacy problem and no one told us? Or do we make it too hard to tell? To give us insight, we turn to data maps, and we're not the first to do so. In 1997, Paul Clayton and other members on a committee at the National Research Council published a book that aimed to serve as guidelines for formulating the discussions that became known as the Hipaa privacy rule. This is a reproduction from their book. It depicts flows of patient information about a hypothetical but typical patient named Alice. It shows representative, not comprehensive, descriptions of flows of health information between organizations in a pre-Hipaa era based on ad hoc knowledge of committee members. The rose-colored lines show you data that are typically redacted, aggregated, or de-identified. It's a little harder to see, but notice that most of them are not, in fact, rose-colored. In 2010, 8 years after the promulgation of the Hipaa privacy rule, I updated the map. The number of entities receiving information more than doubled. New additions include data, outcome, and disease management organizations, and more billing and offshore services. Entities that once received aggregate, temporary, or de-identified information now receive identifiable data. A good example is accreditation and quality assessment. So you can say, how do I know this? What's the source of my information? And the source is all of the numerous things that I've done over the last 8 years at the Data Privacy Lab and as an academic, working in settings with patient information, including on legal cases, de-identification efforts, and re-identification of de-identified data. That's to say that each one of those lines has a footnote as to exactly what the source is. Now, the problem is, the first question we could say, well, so why is that so good? Other than the shock factor that a lot of data sharing is happening, what else are they really good for? And I would argue that they tell us where to look for potential risk of harms. Let me give you an example. This is the 1997 map again, and recall that those rose-colored lines depict data that are typically redacted, aggregated, or de-identified in some way. So here's the employer. If we were to couple this map with the Linode study, it immediately brings into question the strength of the de-identification used if employers can make hiring, firing, and promotion decisions based on the data they receive. The 2010 map also identified new kinds of entities to which a typical patient would be unaware. Here are just a few. If a breach occurred at one of these companies and was reported widely in the press, the typical patient would have no reason to believe her data was held by that company or part of the breach. The 2010 map showed growth in data sharing, but it tells us other things too. For example, the biggest sources of data are from the nodes with the largest out degrees. That would be physicians and hospitals. This makes sense because they're easily identified and they're subject to regulation, and they were the first to have technology. But hospital discharge and ambulatory care databases are big sources too, and they're not subject to Hipaa. And the typical patient has never even heard of them. And the data sharing is one of the largest sources, or the second largest sources of providers of data. The 1997 and the 2010 maps were based on ad hoc knowledge. We need comprehensive maps. So what we're trying to launch today is the datamap.org project. It's a way to involve the public in reporting and vetting reports of personal data sharing. So here's a quick introduction. I realize that it's hard to see, so I'm going to do a live demo and see if it works. Okay, so here we are at the datamap.org is the URL. And if you type in the URL and then you click on maps, you'll get to this page here, which shows us the current state of the map, which will change over time as more and more knowledge is gained. And if you just wanted to learn things from the map, you can, in fact, zoom in and zoom out and move it around to reposition for the best purpose. Every time you hit reload, it will give you a different display of the data. And I can move nodes around so that I can try to display certain things. And there's a set of utilities to point out certain kinds of nodes, like loops, like a loop that would go around to the pharmacy and back to the doctor again, or other things. If you click on any particular node, what you can see over on the right is actually all of the links to it. And then if you were to click on one of them, you can drill down and get more and more information. You can feel free to visit the site. Information and access to the maps that I've been showing you so far are also there as well. Oh, and if you want to participate, and we'll talk a little bit about what participation means, there's a sign up. Provided I can do this. It takes coordination to talk and move my fingers at the same time. And that's where you would sign up. And so feel free to do so. Let's see. That worked. So how does it work? Members of the public sign up to be what are called data detectives. And so they basically report and vet reports of data sharing arrangements that they find online. So to sign up, all you need is an email address. The name is optional. And so once you've signed up as a data detective, you can submit a report that claims that there's a data sharing arrangement happening between two entities. But the report must include a URL that is publicly accessible. And the idea of the URL is that it provides evidence of the claim that you're making for the data sharing. Other data detectives are going to then vet it. So here's an example of contents of a publicly available URL. This is actual discharge data, purchasers of hospital discharge data in the state of Texas. This is a PDF file. It has over 300 recipients of hospital discharge data. It shows you how many quarters they received and how much they paid for it. And each of these rows in this chart would qualify as a single data sharing arrangement on the map. In this case, the entities are named entities rather than abstract, which is what I showed you before, and so that you can actually engage the material either at the detail level, where it names names, kind of thing like this data would provide, or at the abstract level, meaning that an insurance company received hospital discharge data. So there are lots of sources online. There are IPO filings, there's document and legal cases, banks, brokerage houses, and insurance companies have to have statements about information sharing that are publicly available. Online companies tend to have privacy notices, and so on and so on. So what we want to basically do is to simply take this low-hanging fruit, which is information that's publicly available, and begin to document it and put it in a way that we can make some use of it. So now we've got all these reports in there. How do we know what's good? How do we know somebody didn't just mess up our database by giving us a lot of false reports? So we call what's called the vetting game. And so data detectives play this game, and the way it works is very simple. If you're a data detective, we will give you a data report, which will be that there's an edge between these two nodes, and this is the URL that someone has claimed supports this. Your job is to go visit the URL and decide whether you accept it, that it does represent, it's credible and it does represent the data sharing arrangement that's there, reject it, or you can pose a question that you have about it. So now then my job as the designer of the system is to figure out how good a data detective you are. And so the way I've done this is I've taken hundreds of reports that I know are good, and I've made hundreds of reports that I know are bad. And then there are the reports that other people in the public are giving me. So when you're playing the game, you don't know whether I'm giving you a good report, a bad report, or one that I don't know. And if I give you a good report and you reject it, or if I give you a bad report and you accept it, then that tells me how to interpret your input. For those of you who are in computer science or statistics, we basically consider each data detective their own classifier. We end up with an ROC curve. You get an area under your ROC curve. The bigger your area, the better you are, and the more reliable you would be. So Patient Privacy Rights Foundation is going to honor and help provide incentives for participation. And we surveyed several of the most successful of these kind of crowdsourcing ventures to figure out the kinds of incentives that may work the best. And so what we believe will work the best is something that Patient Privacy Rights Foundation stepped up to the plate to offer, and that is the idea of data heroes. So each month, the PPR will name a data hero of the month, and at the end of the year, their expenses will be paid to come to this conference next year to meet and talk with you. And there'll be a special track next year devoted to data detectives and the data map. What are their experiences? Who are the people who are willing to put in their time? What were the kinds of unusual things that happened? We also have a group of others who are willing to do deep dives on interesting connections. That is, a report was made, it seemed really unusual. They're going to go and fly to various places and meet people and put faces to those lines. So I started this project about 3 years ago, and it was sort of dead almost as soon as I finished the map in 2010. People always found the maps interesting, but no one was willing to help fund it or launch it or anything like that until Dr. Peele picked it up and gave it life. So I thank you, Deb, for this, and I thank you for this opportunity, and you are my data hero. Thank you.
So, who's going to be a data detective? Okay. Everybody, right? Right. Thank you. Thank you. Say yes. All right. Well, it's time to talk about the Brandeis Awards, the Louis D. Brandeis Awards, and how did they come to be? Well, we were thinking about them for a long time. We need to recognize privacy heroes. And when you think about privacy, whose name comes to mind? Louis D. And so those of you that were with us last year might remember that we had these buttons last year. And so I knew that we wanted to name these awards the Louis D. Brandeis Privacy Awards. So So he is the one in this country, isn't he? There's a lot of lawyers here, but even people that aren't lawyers really understand his amazing contributions. And of course, he co-authored The Right to Privacy, and there's some information in the programs on the table about him. And I think that article that he wrote is considered the most influential law article of all times. And I was really inspired by his persuasive arguments about privacy and encouraged, particularly because his most famous words were originally a dissent. And somehow, privacy heroes are dissenters again, so we need to dissent and change things as he did. So I was talking actually to Lily about, I have to credit Lily, because she's here in Washington and she knows things that I don't know. I fully admit I don't understand Washington. So I said, Lily, we really want to name these awards the Louis D. Brandeis Awards. And she said, Deborah, my God, you can't do that. You can't just pluck a name out and do that. You have to talk to them. So I was able to find his three grandchildren in their 80s, all lawyers, and they loved this idea. They fully endorsed it, and in fact, they wrote letters that we were to the recipients, and we actually have copies. Like, that reminded me. Yes, thank you. For all the recipients, you get also a personal copy of the family's letter. So that's the story about the Brandeis Awards, and so with their permission, we are awarding them. And what I would like to do now is introduce Marc Rotenberg, who is going to award the first one. I think I can take this out so that because he can't come up here to does this work? Yeah. Okay, good. So I'm going to give this to Marc, who is recovering from a sailing accident, I think. Is that right? Okay, I revealed your health information.
Just part of maintaining an active lifestyle. It's not quite as glamorous as it appears. I mean, you can get good parking spaces in Washington. Of course, you can't drive, so there are some trade-offs there. I just wanted to begin by saying, first of all, that when the family of Justice Brandeis approached me and said that we've heard from this person, Debra Peele, about creating an award in honor of grandfather, do you think that's a good idea? I said, well, I think Debra Peele is the leading advocate for patient privacy rights in the United States, and it's a great idea. And they went ahead and were very happy to create the award. And I noticed recently that the article, The Right to Privacy, according to a law journal, is holding as the #2 article of all time, cited in American Law Reviews. Now, the article that occupies #1 is on economic theory, and knowing how that's all worked out, I think we can just kind of push that one aside and give Brandeis the top spot. It is no doubt the most influential article in American law ever published. The other thing I want to say, of course, as a president and director of Advocate, it's a real honor for me to work with people like our awardee and other members of our advisory board, including Debra Peele, Latanya Sweeney, Frank Pasquali. I have the opportunity to testify in Congress and file briefs in court, and I'm frequently citing their articles, which frankly I don't actually understand. But my thinking is that if I cite them correctly, it will add some credibility to whatever I'm saying. So I want to thank you for all of your prodigious academic work, which is completely over my head. Now, for our awardee. It seems a little bit odd, if you think about it for a moment, to give a Brandeis Award to a non-lawyer, a non-American, a computer scientist, in fact. You're kind of almost at the opposite end of the spectrum, pretty much. But I thought about it a little bit, and I thought this is actually a very appropriate award, and one I think that Justice Brandeis would appreciate. Many of us, of course, think of Brandeis today because of the famous article on the right to privacy, which had a big impact on American tort law, as well as his dissent in the Olmstead case, which had a big impact on American privacy communications law, at least up till 9/11 and the Patriot Act, and things started to change a bit. But what I don't think we appreciate enough about Justice Brandeis's legacy was his tremendous commitment to fact, to investigation, to forming legal opinion and law based on actually understanding the workplace, actually looking closely at business practices, actually trying to understand new technologies. Brandeis was in many ways a great pragmatist. He wanted to know about new technology. He wanted to understand its impact. And he wanted to give the states in particular the freedom to come up with innovative solutions that would safeguard important public interests. And I think in this respect, Ross Anderson is really a perfect choice to receive a Brandeis Award this year from Patient Privacy Rights. Ross, as many of you know, is a professor of computer engineering at Cambridge University. He's been a leading advisor for the British Medical Association. He's been the chair for the Foundation on Information Policy Research. I hope I got that right. And above all, an extremely influential voice in trying to assess the impact of new technologies on the right to privacy, both prodding businesses and government agencies to do a better job, and also calling attention to the fact when they fail to do what Ross knows they need to do. I think Patient Privacy Rights has made a wonderful decision happy to announce one of the recipients of the Brandeis Award of 2012 is Professor Ross Anderson.
Well, thank you, Mark. Thanks, Debs. Thanks, everybody. You know, I'm a computer scientist, not an orator. I'm somewhat overwhelmed by this. You don't expect this sort of thing to come along. And I'm, you know, particularly humbled because in the 17 years I've been campaigning for patient privacy in the UK, we've not really had much in the way of success. You know, the machine has rolled on. We've been ahead of America in terms of healthcare IT for various reasons that we discussed earlier. And so the main thing that we can contribute is the empirical aspect. As Mark mentioned, it's important to document what can go wrong. And we've seen an awful lot of the things that can go wrong when you try and computerize things heedlessly and in a great rush. But I suppose if we are to try and make a strategic analogy out of this, we might hark back to the last war, when Britain learned some lessons in 1939 and 1940, which then turned out to be useful to America once America was drawn into the fray after that. So we can at least tell you where the traps and the pitfalls are and where the fire is likely to come from. And we hope that our experience may be of some use to you. Thank you.
All right. And next up, my name is Frank Pasquali, and I'm a professor of health law. And it's a great honor to be giving an award tonight to Representative Joe Barton. I've been studying his work in privacy for some time, and it's terrific to have a chance to go over that tonight. So just to introduce you to Representative Barton, he has degrees in both industrial administration and engineering. And at Texas A&M, he was the outstanding industrial engineering student of 1972, the outstanding student of his class in that field. And I think that level of engagement with the technical details sort of echoes what Ross's background, and sort of a real interest in how business is run. He was a plant manager at the Ennis Business Forms Company, and he was a gas decontrol consultant. After this career in the private sector, and I think it's very valuable private sector experience that we need to see more of among our elected officials. In 1984, he was elected to Congress from the 6th District of Texas. And since 2003, he's been the co-chair of the Congressional Privacy Caucus and a member of the Tea Party Caucus since recently. And I think that one of the things that, you know, when you do a search in terms of privacy and Joe Barton and try and look at his record, what's fantastic to see is in a highly polarized Washington environment, you're constantly seeing Representative Barton and other representatives that deeply care about privacy really going to the mat in what can be very unpopular situations. For example, I mean, just recently, he's weighed in on the cybersecurity bill. And as anyone who knew, I wrote an article on fusion centers recently. I followed, you know, Priscilla Regan's work on legislating privacy. As anybody knows, it takes enormous courage to go up against, say, the cyber industrial defense military complex and say, wait a second, let's really protect Fourth Amendment rights. And Representative Barton's been willing to do that. He also, I think, really exemplifies the best values of conservatism. When I think of Joe Barton, I think of a conservative, and that's against overweening government power. It's skeptical of grand plans. It's skeptical of crony capitalism. It protects our children, as he has weighed in recently with respect to plans to bring kids under 13 onto social networks. And he's weighed in against that, or to really take that critically. And finally, and I think most importantly for our purposes tonight, when you look at some of the legislation that Representative Barton has actually gotten through with respect to this banning the sale of personal health information without patient consent, other legislation involving audit trails and things. I think these are really the foundation for health privacy enforcement in the future. So it's a great honor tonight and privilege to award this Louis D. Brandeis Award to Joe Barton. So thank you so much. Sorry. Congratulations. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It really is an honor to be the first congressional recipient of the Brandeis Award. I say first because Mr. Markey hadn't received his yet. But it does feel somewhat challenging, to be honest, to be up here. We have 2 PhDs who are receiving awards, and you got 2 congressmen. One from Massachusetts who's a liberal and one from Texas who's a conservative. It says something about the issue that people that are extremely well educated, like our PhDs, can work so hard for privacy, and then people that are elected, and in the case of the Congress, Mr. Markey and myself, the requirements to work at McDonald's are higher than the requirements to be a congressman. You got to be 25, live in the state, and be a citizen of the state. That's it. There's no educational, there's no IQ requirement, there's no property. I mean, there's no, that's it. They wanted the House to be close to the people, and certainly in my case, that's succeeded because my background would not lead you to believe that I'd ever be elected. In fact, when I decided to run for Congress, we took a vote, a straw poll of my family. I polled my mother, my father, my wife, and my 2 grandmothers, and myself, and it was 4-1 not to do it. In fact, my grandmother Barton, who at the time was in her 80s, was a lifelong Democrat. I mean, she was a dyed-in-the-wool, I wouldn't say liberal Democrat, but she was a progressive Democrat. And she had promised my grandfather Barton, Papa Barton, that she would never vote for a Republican, never. So when I went to talk to her, I said, Mama Barton, I'm going to run for Congress, and she was kind of neutral about that. And I said, but I'm going to run as a Republican. She said, oh my God. And she did not vote for me. She campaigned for me. She rode in the Pioneer Day Parade in Whitney, and she went to the nursing homes with my Uncle Leroy, but she did not vote for me. But the second time I ran, she did vote for me. I did finally get her. And then the third time, before she passed away, she voted straight Republican. But that's because she voted absentee and I voted her ballot. Anyway, it is an honor to be here this evening and to receive this award. As Congressman Markey will tell you when he receives his, it is not easy being for privacy in the United States Congress on either side of the aisle. Even though it is, the privacy is not specifically mentioned in the Constitution or in the Bill of Rights, it is clear that had our founding fathers felt that it needed to be protected explicitly, they would have done so. And they took it for granted that it was such an obvious thing that they didn't need to mention it. Although two of the original Bill of Rights, the Fourth Amendment against unreasonable search and seizure, and the amendment that against quartering of troops in your home, are clearly privacy protection amendments. But in the modern age, if you do a poll of the population, the right to privacy is going to get about 99% of the votes. But when it comes to legislation or to protect it, there is always something that is a little bit more important at that moment. Whether it's the cybersecurity bill, which Ed and I tried to get a privacy amendment made in order on the House floor without success, whether there's a bill that is some sort of a marketing bill, an economic bill, there is something that takes precedent at that time. Privacy is never the issue. So if you ask people, are we for protection of your privacy? Well, sure. If you ask the Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader of the House, the Whip of the House, the Minority Leader, the Minority Whip, they would all unequivocally say they're for privacy protection and mean it until it comes time to protect it, and then the right, the need to mine a database, the need to collect data, the need to protect cybersecurity threat, whatever it is at that moment is a little bit more important. And so Congressman Markey and I, for almost the last 10 years, I guess, have had the Privacy Caucus, and every year we introduce a bill and we try to get amendments made in order. This year alone, we've had 2 or 3 policy seminars, and it seems like we write a letter every week to Facebook or Google or Yahoo or Verizon or somebody who is all for privacy, and they have privacy councils and privacy experts, but somehow they just don't get around to really doing it, you know? They just don't, you know, Facebook is the latest. Yesterday, Ed and I fired off another letter to Facebook, you know, and we'll get the obligatory non-response or whatever. But we're going to keep trying, and we will win over time. I mean, if there's anything that's more important in the 21st century than it was in the 18th century, it's privacy protection, because the ubiquitousness of the ability to collect data on yourself without your permission, without your knowledge, is almost exponential. I shudder to know what information is on various databases about myself and my family that I know nothing about, and I never will. I never will. So I'm sincere when I say thank you for the award, and I pledge, and I'm sure Ed will pledge, we will keep working, and we will prevail. We will ultimately prevail, because 1, it's the right thing to do, and 2, the more people like yourself and Fair Warning get involved, the easier it will be for those of us that legislate to do our job. So thank you very much, and I'm sincere, and thank you for this award.
Well, it's great to be here, and I want to first salute Debra Peele, who's my great friend and has been talking to me about these issues for many, many years, and is the strongest advocate I've ever met for privacy for all Americans, and certainly health privacy. So, Debra, thank you for all you do. I want to recognize my former colleague Joe Barton and congratulate him on receiving this great award and for all the great work he's done in the Congress in this area. It's really a terrific effort. As for myself, I'm just happy to be where anybody knows who I am. You've been in public office for as long as I was. After you get out, I've been out 6 years now, and people see me in public places, but they usually have trouble remembering who I am. And so I got a great story the other day to show you we still have freedom of speech in the country. I was in the Chicago airport, and 3 women came up, and they knew who I was and remembered what I'd done, and they were obviously Democrats, and they just were effusive in their praise for what I'd done in my public life, all the efforts that I had undertaken. They were just going on and on and on. It was embarrassing. And as they were doing this, a young man I could see in the corner of my eye, I couldn't really see him, but I knew he was coming up behind me. He came up behind me, and as they were gushing on, he whispered in my ear, "Don't listen to this stuff." He said, "I always thought you were an and you're still an Is this a great country or what? I mean, I thought I could maybe get him into a debate of whether this was true or not. But it's really great to be here, and it's great to have an opportunity to give an award to my former colleague and great friend who I came here with in 1977, Ed Markey. And I would just start this by saying that for a number of years I was leader of the Democrats in both the majority and the minority. And Ed carried and was the champion of a lot of important issues. But in my view, and this is from my experience with him, the issue that he was most passionate about and repeatedly led with people like Representative Barton on was the privacy issue. This issue is in his heart and in his head. He understands it, he believes in it, he cares about it, and he knows how important it is to the people he represents and to all of the American people. As Representative Barton said, this issue has probably arrived a long time ago, but if it ever arrived, it has arrived today. There isn't an American citizen who doesn't understand today that their privacy is under attack constantly. And they want it protected, and they want Congress and state legislatures and other entities to do what they need to do to protect their privacy. And Ed is at the top of the class in doing that in so many different ways. I've got a list of the legislation here. I'm not going to bore you with reading it, but he has been a sponsor, co-sponsor, a main sponsor of all the leading privacy legislation, including a recent effort to make sure Hipaa actually works, rather than just talking about it, making sure it's enforced and making sure it works. Last two things I'd say about Ed that I need to say as we bring this up. The first one is that in anything he's done in the Congress, he has always been able and willing to reach out to do things on a bipartisan basis. Representative Barton just talked about the fact they had worked together for 10 years on the committee, in the House, in the Congress, on these issues. They don't agree on everything, that's for sure. But they agree on this, and Ed has found a way to work with his colleagues on both sides of the aisle to get things done. And unless I'm missing something, we need a lot more of that in this Congress. And so I salute Ed for doing that. Finally, of all the people I met in my service in 28 years in the House, I never met anybody who had a greater passion for justice and fairness than Ed Markey. Justice and fairness. I'm sure it came from his parents, his constituents, his educational background, but that passion shone through in everything he did, including the right of privacy, which every American enjoys and wants. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a high honor to give the Brandeis Award to my friend and former colleague, Ed Markey.
Thank you. So it's my great honor to receive this from my great friend for 36 years, since we were both elected during an era when, for one brief period of time, they actually elected children to the Congress 36 years ago. And the font of the commitment that I have to these issues is the same that Dick has, which begins with the fact that both of our fathers were milkmen, delivering milk door to door. And so when you live in a home like that, you learn things that are fundamental. And that's what Dick brought during all of his years as the leader of the Democrats in the House of Representatives to absolutely everything that he did, everything that he touched, every speech he ever gave. And this award being presented to me by this great man, and that's what he is, it just means the world to me. The combination of the award and the person who gave it to me is really what makes this evening so special to me. And so I thank you, Dick, and I thank you for everything that you have done for our country and for me as well. Thank you. And Debra Peele, a one-woman multinational commitment to privacy, a force of nature unto herself that has no comparison anywhere on the planet in terms of what she means to this issue. I mean, she is just absolutely unbelievable, and is a sublessee of my office, okay? Because that is where she has been living for the last 20 years on all of these issues. And she insistently, persistently, consistently demands that this issue be dealt with, they be recognized, and be included in the halls of public policy in Washington, D.C. And she brings the common sense of Texas, which she shares with Joe Barton, to our body. And I agree with Dick that, and with Joe that victory is inevitable on all of these issues. Back in 1996, when I was the lead Democrat doing the Telecommunications Act of 1996, not one home in America had broadband in 1996. Not one home had broadband. Not that long ago, huh? Well, in that bill, in the House side, with Dick as the leader, I was able to include language that mandated that the Federal Communications Commission build a privacy bill of rights across all communications platforms. In the conference committee, in the final 2 days of the conference committee, the word came back to me that there were a couple of senators who were insisting that it be taken out or there would be no bill. And you have to understand, because Joe and I are good examples of this, the Republicans are the opponents. The Senate is the enemy. The Senate is the enemy because they can act in a highly petulant fashion at the critical junctures that extract concessions that are all out of proportion to the power that they should be able to exercise as individuals. Okay? And so since then, I have made it my commitment to ensure that piece by piece we do construct a privacy Bill of Rights. In 1999, we were on the way to repealing Glass-Steagall. And Glass-Steagall was a 1934 law that many people believed needed updating. I had a bit of an arched eyebrow cast towards it, but I tried to be pragmatic in how I would respond. And what I said was, if we're going to allow insurance companies and brokerages and banks all now merge together and share all the information that each of them knew about an individual, that would mean that the checks that had been written by a family for Ritalin for their children would now also be seen by the insurance company that had done the insurance exam, the health exam for the family member, et cetera, et cetera. And so the bill came out of the House Banking Committee, no privacy. The bill came out of Senate Banking, no privacy. But there was one committee that was left, which was the Energy and Commerce Committee, because pursuant to the construction of the Glass-Steagall law in 1934, there had been a division as well in the Congress where the securities jurisdiction was in the Commerce Committee and the banking jurisdiction was in the Banking Committee, mirroring the separation that was actually in the law. And so we had one shot at it. And so I introduced the amendment saying that there had to be a privacy bill of rights now for these families, as all of this information was aggregated so it wasn't turned into a single product of the healthcare status of every family in the United States. And I made the amendment thinking that, well, here's this liberal Democrat, that will seek to accomplish this goal. And then, as I finished, a hand went up on the Republican side. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, seeks recognition. For what purpose? I rise in support of the Markey Amendment. Now, it was a funny thing that happened in the hearing that day. It was a markup. It was a full committee. It's of the biggest bill, the biggest money bill going through Congress that year. And sitting out in the audience, there were maybe 100 lobbyists, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Travelers Insurance, every major company in the United States.
And my PAC contributions dropped 20%.
And Joe Barton said, I rise in support of the Markey Amendment. And so now a debate broke out in the committee as Joe began to outline his concerns about privacy. And panic was breaking out because all the members were sitting over here and all the lobbyists are sitting over there, and there can't be any communication. We're about to have a debate with congressmen actually having to do all of the thinking for themselves. And so, privacy reports in the New York Times the next day. They reported that one lobbyist for one of those aforementioned large firms up in New York City went outside and very loudly could be heard calling back to New York City saying, we have a big problem. And that big problem was that at the conclusion of that debate, on a bipartisan basis, with the members just thinking about their own families, they voted to include it in this Glass-Steagall bill. And so all of the privacy laws in the financial sector go back to that moment, okay, and that debate, where the members, as you're saying, Joe, began to just reflect what the 99% want on the planet. And so Joe and I, we created a privacy caucus after that. And on a bipartisan basis, Democrat and Republican, we just keep looking at Google and Facebook. But we look at Hipaa, and say, as I did with Deborah sitting in my office every day, we are going to completely pound the administration into submission on the drafting and the implementation of Hipaa. And then when we passed the $20 billion in the stimulus bill to have this electronic communication of medical information, Deborah once again comes and sits in my office and says, we must pound these people to make sure that the information as it's being transmitted isn't compromised and turned into something that comes back to haunt people. And the reason that that is the case is that there is a Dickensian quality to this new information era. It is the best of wires and the worst of wires simultaneously. It can enable and ennoble, or it can degrade and debase. And whether it does one or the other depends ultimately upon the values that human beings attach to these technologies. What purpose do we want them to serve? And so, yes, we want all the benefits of speedy communication of medical information, processing of bills so that the cost can be reduced. All of those things are great. But the price that is paid should not be the compromise of the privacy of every American. That's too high of a price. And so on all those healthcare records, the values which I bring to it are the same values that Dick and I had as boys growing up in a house where the doctor and the nurse, they were sacred people. You didn't know any doctors. You never met any doctors except when you were in their office. They didn't live in your neighborhood. But that nurse, when she took out your record, there was a little key, and she would pull out that metal drawer and pull out your file, and you knew that when you were in that room, the only people who would know about your secrets were you, your mother, Dr. McDonald, and the nurse, and that was going back in and locked up. And no one else was going to know about it. That was the world we grew up in. And that's the world that people still want. They want that secret about the teenage daughter that has anorexia, still locked up. They haven't told anyone else in the family. It's not a product to be sold to companies, And so when Facebook or others say, well, if a teenage girl goes online and just checks out a site for weight loss, why can't we just turn that whole thing into a product that we sell to 100 companies that we can monetize? Well, one of the reasons is that girl is a very vulnerable person. And being reminded all day long, every site that she goes to, that, she has this issue because she made one inquiry trying to find out a little bit about weight loss, or that whole issue in general, is just not something that should be compromised. It's not something that should be turned into a product. And a big part of Facebook's actual market value is basically, unfortunately, attached to their promise that they're going to have all the records of kids who are 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8 that they can market to. Well, I think that's one thing that Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives should all be able to agree upon, That kids should have a right to grow up. Kids should have a right to have the right to make mistakes, that they should have a right to mature, We should all be able to agree on that. When Dick and I were growing up, we were kind of in a forgive and forget era, So you made a big mistake when you were 14, But by the time you were applying to college, long forgotten, Not so in the Facebook era, Not so in this modern era. It lives on, and it can come back to haunt these children. And these medical secrets, they're just too important, to be allowed to be commoditized. So Joe and I, we're going to continue. And we're not going to stop, and we will win. In the same way we won on Glass-Steagall, we're going to continue to win. We made Hipaa as strong as we could have made it, each issue right down the line. I represent Brandeis University. Okay? So it's a great honor for me to be the second winner of the Brandeis Award here this evening. It pretty much, is my life in a nutshell. But we venerate Louis D. Brandeis in Waltham, Massachusetts, in the heart of my district. This is about as high an award as anyone can be given. He is one of the, one of the great citizens of the 20th century in the United States, and for me, this honor is something that I am going to hold dear. Dick left, and Dick no longer is in the same income group that I am and Joe is, okay? And so the compensation which we receive are these relatively inexpensive awards which are given to us, but invaluable because of the sentiment that's behind it. That's why it's so important to us. It means the world to us. Thank you all so much for
Okay, you didn't expect me back again. I'm Larry Gostin. Anyway, sorry, Larry couldn't be here, and so I'm going to read his introduction to, I think I'm going to read it, for Alan Weston, who couldn't be here either. I think many of you know Alan is recovering, and we wish him very well, and he wanted to be here, and so, you know, when we first talked to him about this award, he said, well, I can't come. And I said, well, we can fix that, you know. We'd love to present this award to you, even if you cannot come. And so he chose his law partner, Bob Belair, to accept on his behalf. So let me read Larry's words about Alan. It's a great pleasure to present this award to Alan Weston, which will be accepted by my longtime associate, Robert Blair. Just so you know, or his longtime associate, Robert Blair, excuse me. Alan Weston is Professor Emeritus of Public Law and Government at Columbia University, where he's taught for 37 years. Professor Weston, as I'm sure you know, is perhaps the father of the field of consumer data privacy and protection, including health privacy protection. His 1967 pioneering book, Privacy and Freedom, is the seminal work in the information privacy field. Professor Weston's work on the book was supported by Carnegie, initially as a project of the Special Committee on Science and Law of the Association of the Bar of the City of New York. Privacy and Freedom was path-breaking in its inclusion of the rapidly developing field of data surveillance. Dr. Weston is currently finishing a massive book, we're all waiting for this, titled Privacy in Western Civilization. Can't wait to read it. From the Hebrews and Greeks to the Internet Age. Yes. During the 1970s, Weston edited the Civil Liberties Review, a bi-monthly publication of the American Civil Liberties Union Foundation from his home. And with Robert Belair, Dr. Weston founded Privacy and American Business, a nonprofit think tank that they led in Washington from 1993 to 2006. So, Robert, Bob, would you come accept for Alan?
Thank you.
Thanks so
Let me
much
put
for
this
being
down,
here.
yeah.
Oh, yeah, let's leave it here.
Put it right there. Alan really wanted to be here, and he extends his best wishes to all of you, and he is recovering. I met Alan Weston in 1969 as a first-year law student at Columbia. Alan was doing a project on NYSIS, which was then collecting tolls on the New York State Thruway, but it was also for the first time taking photos of license plates. Imagine that. I thought it was a fascinating project. I applied. He said to me, well, you don't read very well. I said, I want a 2L. You don't even know how to do research. And I said, well, would you just give me a chance for 2 weeks? If it doesn't work out, don't pay me. So he laughed, and here we are almost 45 years later. He's been my colleague right along. And of all the work Alan's done, and he has done, and Deborah's alluded to it, really, really important work. Our whole notion of fair information practice, our notion that individuals ought to be able to exercise control over their personal information really arises first from Alan's book in 1967, Privacy and Freedom, later Databanks in a Free Society in 1973. So he would really appreciate the great company that he's in tonight. He would greatly appreciates getting the award from Debra and from this organization. He left me strict instructions that I'm to say 4 things. So here we go quickly. 1, he really likes Louis Brandeis. He talked about him a fair amount in his book. And one of the things he likes is that, as you know, Brandeis and Warren in 1890 wrote about technology outflanking protections then available. He was worried, Brandeis was, about what he called snap photography. He was worried about telephones, and he recognized right away that existing tort notions were inadequate. Secondly, as some of you know, Alan loves public opinion surveys. Done over 50 of them, and over 12 of them deal with privacy, with health privacy. And his point is that of all the areas, and there are so many important privacy areas, financial records that Ed talked about, employment records, various kinds of surveillance, the American public, Alan's surveys show, and others do as well, care most about the privacy of their health information. Third, Alan is fond of saying that he's a Libra, and so he's always looking for a balance. And in the case of health records, this is the most challenging balance of all, and Ed Markey alluded to this. We've got to use technology effectively. We've got to share information to provide health care and to drive down cost. And we've got to still, and first and foremost, protect privacy. It's a hard deal, and it's all about balance. And then lastly, Alan said, be sure to emphasize, we have got to continue to move toward electronic health records. It requires public trust to do that. His surveys show that only about 25% of the public believes that we can do that in a way that is protective of their personal privacy. Al Franken the other day, Senator Franken, lambasted the problems associated with the misuse of health records. Data breaches, terrible problem. We have a lot of data breaches in this space. We've got to do better. So those are the 4 things. Let me, on behalf of Alan, thank all of you for the great work you do, and Deborah. Thank the other award winners, and keep up the great work, guys. Thank you.